Lennon was brought to the emergency room of the Roosevelt site, St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital, this evening, shortly before 11 p.m. He was dead on arrival. Extensive resuscitative efforts were made, but in spite of transfusions and many procedures, he could not be resuscitated. He had multiple gunshot wounds in his chest, in his left arm, and in his back.
How many shots are we talking about?
There were 7 wounds in his body. There was a significant injury of the major vessels inside the chest, which caused a massive amount of blood loss, which probably resulted in his death.
Did he lose consciousness right away, do you think, from the type of wound?
Certain that he was dead at the moment that the first shot hit his body.
Well, one of tremendous shock. Particularly, 5 minutes ago I learned about it when someone rang me from Washington. And to be woken up by that at 6 o'clock in the morning is pretty awful news. I haven't seen John for about 18 months, I suppose, but I was always very, very fond of him. We worked very closely together in the early days. As I say, although we hadn't worked together for a long time, nor did we see each other a great deal, because obviously he lived in New York and kept himself much for himself.
His aggressiveness, his abrasive, and yet his sensitivity. He would not suffer fools gladly. If anybody didn't match him for his wit, he used to give them a terrible time with his sardonic sort of humor. But basically, he was very sensitive, as his music showed.
Oh, I think John perhaps changed more dramatically or more drastically than the other 3. I believe he was possibly the dreamer out of the 4. Perhaps the most, dare I say, a paradox. I mean, aggressive and yet romantic in his imagination. I think he was the one that usually wanted to try things with different kicks, like the Maharishi and the meditation and the dropping out and the flower power and everything else, all the different things that the Beatles in the 60s went through anyway.
It wasn't the answer, it just gave us a glimpse of the possibility. And in the 70s, everybody's going, nyeh, 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 nyeh. And possibly in the 80s, maybe everybody would say, okay, well, let's project the positive side of life again. All we're saying is give peace a chance. Literally came out of my mouth as a spoken word to a reporter. After being asked millions and millions of times, what are you doing? Well, all I'm saying is give peace a chance. Not that I have the answer or I've got a new format for society, because I don't, and I don't believe anybody else has. Show me the plan, there's revolutions there. I don't want to have to sell my soul again, as it were, to have a hit record. I've discovered that I can live without it, and it makes it happier for me, but I'm not going to come back in and try and create a persona who would not be myself. I hope the young kids like it as well, but I'm really talking to the people that grew up with me. I'm saying, here I am now. How are you? How's your relationship going? Did you get through it all? Wasn't the 70s a drag, you know? Here we are, well, let's try and make the 80s good, you know?
John Lennon and his wife Yoko were returning home. As they approached the lobby entrance to their building at 1 West 72nd Street, an assailant fired a number of shots into Mr. Lennon. The responding police took Mr. Lennon to Roosevelt Hospital, where he was pronounced dead on arrival. We also have captured one suspect who is in police custody, and we've recovered a .38 caliber revolver from the scene.
What happened here was that about half an hour ago, I suppose at about 11:15 in the evening New York time, a bulletin came on all the television stations saying a man tentatively identified as John Lennon had been shot and wounded in the chest and was rushed to Roosevelt Hospital. The police had a suspect in hand. They weren't giving away any details. Then, within about 10 minutes, a bulletin came through that John Lennon was in Roosevelt Hospital. There was blood all over the place, and a whole team of surgeons were working furiously desperately trying to save him. 10 minutes later came through the news that it was indeed John Lennon. The people could not save him. He had died from massive wounds in the chest, I believe 3 gunshot wounds. And the newsagent on some of the channels giving this information, one of the lady newsreaders actually broke down and cried as she announced the bulletin.
It wasn't the answer, it just gave us a glimpse of the possibility. And in the 70s everybody's going, nyeh, 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 and possibly in the 80s maybe everybody would say, okay, well let's project the positive side of life again. All we're saying is give peace a chance. Literally came out of my mouth as a spoken word to a reporter after being asked millions and millions of times, what are you doing? Well, all I'm saying is give peace a chance, not that I have the answer or I've got a new format for society, because I don't, and I don't believe anybody else has. Show me the plan, there's revolutions there. I don't want to have to sell my soul again, as it were, to have a hit record. I've discovered that I can live without it, and it makes it happier for me, but I'm not going to come back in and try and create a persona who would not be myself. I hope the young kids like it as well, but I'm really talking to the people that grew up with me. I'm saying, here I am now. How are you? How's your relationship going? Did you get through it all? Wasn't the 70s a drag, you know? Here we are. Well, let's try and make the 80s good, you know?
I pointed out that fact in reference to England, that we meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time. I wasn't knocking it or putting it down, I was just saying it as a fact. And it is true, especially more for England than here. You know, but I'm not saying that we're better or greater or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person or God as a thing or whatever it is. You know, I just said what I said and it was wrong or was taken wrong, and now it's all this.
This time they're ready for us, man. We can go on and do our stuff without even changing a thing. We could go on right back, and I dug out the old records we'd made. I dug out the B-52s, and then I talked to my assistant who tried to turn me on to them 18 months before, but I said, no, I'm not into the music. I didn't want to hear anything. He was trying to play me Pretenders and Madness and all that stuff, and I didn't want to listen to it. And I said, give me some more of this. What's going on out there? He brought all this, you know, cookie, whatever you want to call it, stuff in, and we looked at each other and we thought, ha-ha, they finally caught up to what we were trying to do all the time, which is another form of expression. And we thought, this time, surely, they're going to understand it. And here we are doing it again. It's not that much different from what we did. If you take the Plastic Ono Band albums, which are titleless, I call mine Mother for reference. It had Mother and God and a couple of tracks like that on. And her album, which was a same cover but a kind of reverse trick, the first track on her thing is called Why. You play that, and you play something modern now, and see if we weren't on the right track in 1969 or not.
Right on is the word.
Right on is the word.
Hi, this is Brian Catt. John Lennon, in music, exemplified the anger of the 60s. Lennon didn't just say it's all beautiful. He questioned, he probed, he attacked, and finally, when Yoko gave him the strength to go public as a post-Beatle individual, he actually tried to do something about it all. Lennon was the bold one, intellectually adventurous, experimental with thoughts and ideas and points of view. He was always upset by something, caring about issues and events which the rest of us avoided, or hoped would just go away and make our flower-powered dreams a reality. He died in the most aggressive, impatient, antagonistic, colourful and exciting city in the world. A city he loved more than anywhere else, and which kind of fitted in with how Lennon was and how he approached life. John Lennon was synonymous with sarcasm and cynicism, yet he was blessed with a wonderful sense of wry humour about everything, and I suspect a deep optimism underneath it all, a real love of life and living. Lennon gave music a hip, humorous intellectualism. I'm very sorry he's gone, but I'm very glad I was around when he was. because his music and his words made life a lot richer for me.
My feeling is in relation to the Beatles and their music, Andrew, is that I don't think, certainly in my time, and I don't think in your time to come, that we are ever going to see a band of talented people leave such a mark on the world, on the music of the world. The Beatlemania thing was and still is the biggest single event that I have ever witnessed in the 30 years that I've been in the recording business. I was very fortunate to have been involved in the industry long before the Beatles and John Lennon and McCartney and Ringo and Harrison came into being. But the impact of those guys and their music was just the most dramatic thing to be seen in virtually the history of the recording industry. And you really had to be there to believe the impact that it made. And I think quite apart from the impact their music made, them as a band, the songs are just delightful beyond a dream almost. I mean, some of those songs have been recorded literally thousands of times by other people. They still stand up whether they're recorded orchestrally or whether it's a single vocalist doing them. There is just some wonderful characteristic about their music that I believe will turn those songs into masterpieces if they are not already masterpieces.
Hi, this is Pee Wee Wilson, and my thoughts on the death of John Lennon are, of course, like everybody else, sad, and I was dreadfully shocked at the time that it happened. I guess the whole world was. I suppose Lennon represented a symbol of activities which were involved with changing the consciousness, if you like, or changing the rules of the game. And I suppose all of us were dreadfully shocked by his demise. At the same time, I have very fond memories of the guy, particularly during that early period of the Beatles. I suppose I shared that with everybody. And I suppose that of all of his works, I enjoyed all the Beatles' works, in particular the Magic Mystery Tour and, of course, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Band, which was a fantastic album. And they were the records that I remember very much associated with Lennon. At the same time, I suppose the single album that stands out in my mind and the single song that sticks out in my mind is Imaginer. And I guess every time I hear that, that encapsulates what Lennon was really all about. He certainly was involved with peace, and it's a dreadful irony that we lost him. It's a very, very sad affair.
In Sydney, Glenn A. Baker. Glenn, what did the death of John Lennon mean to you?
Well, I can remember when I first heard it, it was like the death of John Kennedy, sort of almost 20 years before. Everyone seems to remember what they were doing at the time. Of all places, I was actually in EMI Records, and I was there with a couple of executives, and it came on the radio, and there was sort of this white ashen faces all around the room. At that time, they only said that John had been shot. Nobody knew that he died. And then radio stations started to call me, and TV stations, for comments, and I can remember being quite a bit shell-shocked at the time, though I didn't have much of a chance to think of the implications because I was so busy talking about the Lennon legacy and what he meant. It was only, I suppose, a few days later that it dawned on me what a sort of horrific, senseless act that it was, and what a tragic waste of a very, very great man.
What happens when you look back 5 years now, when you say hear a special like we're doing today on the death of John Lennon? What do you feel then?
I still feel a real sense of loss. I still feel that the world has lost, not so much even a great musician and a craftsman, but just a great citizen of the planet, a man who had a conscience, a man who was not afraid to speak out on matters, but a man who also was very human and had a passion for life, had a great wit and a great charm. I mean, Paul McCartney said in an interview that recently came to light that he was no Martin Luther Lennon, he was no saint, that he could drive people crazy, that and I think that was that's the great charm of the man, that, he was a great working class hero who sort of, was fast on his feet, had, determination, but also had some vision. He wasn't afraid of being sort of made look silly occasionally if he felt that he was getting his message across. And the sort of outpouring of devotion that occurred soon after John's death, and that occurs every year on the anniversary of his death, I think sort of underlines the way that he reached out and touched a lot of people, not just people in the music industry, but just people who grew up in the 60s, who grew up in the 70s, grew up with John Lennon and sort of understood him for the man that he was.
Mm-hmm. What could you say to the people that didn't grow up with John Lennon, that are growing up now? What could you say in retrospect of John Lennon?
All I can say is that very few generations are blessed with true iconoclasts, with those people who can sort of cut through the wishy-washiness and the hype, and can sort of deliver their personality fully fleshed. We were fortunate. We in the 60s had people like John Lennon. There were others. There weren't too many others. And I don't know that there's been too many others like them. Maybe we find those sort of figures more in politics. Maybe it is the Roosevelts and the Kennedys, and maybe it is the Disraelis and people like that, and the Gladstones. It's not often you find a man you could almost call a statesman in music. But, few generations are blessed to have someone of vision and someone who can really sort of galvanise the attention of a community. We were blessed like that, and I don't think there's been too many people like him. The thing that always amazed me about Lennon's music was that, like his partner Paul McCartney, I think his greatest moments, his most creative moments, was when he stepped out of the mould that we saw him in and did the opposite. I mean, the same thing applied to McCartney. When McCartney did a screaming rocker like I'm Down, it worked perfectly well. And when John Lennon, who was seen as the harsh and cynical one, did a gentle song like Girl, which you didn't really expect of him, then it worked magnificently for him. I think there is more depth in Lennon's music than was ever given credit for. And songs like Girl and In My Life, I truly think are absolutely timeless.